Thank you, Mark. Thank you for putting together such a great conference. And thanks to the previous panel for waking everyone up. So, you set the night, you set a stage in terms of the discussions, and we'll take it from there. I'm Mary D'Souza. I run a single family office. We invest in private credit, real estate, private equity. I also am on the advisory board of Star Mountain Capital and also an investor. And on the board of a trucking company, which is very interesting. And on a couple of non-profit boards, Community Access, which takes care of mental health, low income, housing, and homelessness. With that, I'll introduce you to my fellow panelists. We have Safa.
Let's connect on LinkedIn because
We'll be talking about VCs, right? So can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Hi everyone, it's great to be here. It's my first time in Naples and this is wonderful. I'm Safar Ashti. I run an early stage venture firm called Think Plus in Palo Alto, Silicon Valley. Before that, I was a private investor. Before that, I spent 10 years on Wall Street as an analyst. That's kind of where I made all my connections, made my name, and that's when we had a discussion that Mark was referring to Eric Schmidt. Again, he had joined Google. It was 2 weeks after he had joined, and I had a meeting with him and others. And he asked me, so what do you think we should do for a business model with Google? And I kind of looked and said, I think we should follow what GoTo.com, the inventor of the search monetization model, is doing. And he looked at me and said, yeah, that's probably right. So, what I should have done, of course, at that time, quit my job at investment bank and join Google, which I didn't. I come from Iran, as Paul mentioned, and I also spent some time in China, studying China and environment for ecosystem for entrepreneurship in the 2000 and became convinced that that's going to be the next big market, and that was going to be the second market I had after search. So I would like to talk about China as well, but let me hand over.
Thank you, Safa. Kayur runs Bay Capital, which is a long-only private equity, not private equity, private and public asset manager. Kayur, can you tell us more about what you guys do and a little bit of an overview on what's going on in India?
May I suggest he go last, because then he could give a longer response? Maybe Zbigniew, so you want to introduce Zbigniew?
Okay, we'll go to Zibi, and then we'll come back to Kayur.
You mean I'm going to be short? Good.
Well, first of all, I love that he was described as the Mark Sainer of Poland. And I was like, well, we got to meet this guy. Who is he? And there's a 60 involved here.
Okay, so I'm from Poland, and for more than 25 years we have a group of 2 companies connected with audiovisual installations, rental, and this business, but for some years we also do investments in the startups. We create some big conferences, but I think there will be more time later on to tell about this. And now we are in Poland, after the changes, 1989, we had like the first generation companies, so we are right now thinking to create a single family office. That's in general.
But talk about the 40-60 thing real quick.
We will do that next. Yeah. So Kayur, maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview on your firm as well as what's happening in India.
Thank you, Mary, and it's great to be here. First time for me in Naples. Fantastic. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Mark, and thanks everyone for being here. So my name is Kayur Majmudar. I am co-founder and managing partner at Bay Capital Partners. We're an India-focused investment firm. We've been investing in India as a firm for 15 years now. I've been at it for more than 25 years. And we invest across both public and private markets. And as a firm, that's essentially what we do. I was actually listening with keen interest to the previous panel, Deepika, Anna, Bill, and Stephen, and I think there were many interesting things that were brought up. And so, Mary, if you allow me, let me just take maybe 5 or 7 minutes to just go through and contextualize sort of some of the threads that were spoken about, right? So, so just a quick thing about us. We're an investment firm, India focused. We've been out for 15 years. Interestingly enough, 90% of our capital comes from North America, the US. This is all institutional capital. And so here's the India story, right? 1.4 billion people. And India should be thought of as an agglomeration of countries, as a continent in its own right, and not a single country. The largest state in India has a population of 235 million. That's pretty much 2/3 of the entire United States. And I think over the next decade or more, one very, very significant structural shift is playing out, which is that the entire world is aging and India is actually getting young. And Bill, Stephen, and I sort of spoke to that point where the population in China, if you looked at the numbers back in last year, they had a population decrease of 800,000. So China has actually peaked. You've had a 40-year tailwind that's about to turn. And so India certainly, stands in good shape. The other interesting dynamic that's playing out in India, and if you just think about emerging markets about the world, you typically think of the country and households as a pyramid, somebody at the bottom of the pyramid, somebody at the top. And interestingly, India has actually started morphing from a pyramid into a diamond, which means that you are, over the next 8 or 10 years, going to have close to 200 million households coming into middle income, with all the aspiration, with all the purchasing power. And obviously the knock-on effects of that on consumption and so on and so forth are of course quite compelling. And here's sort of the journey over the last 40 years, and I don't need to say anything else. Last year, interestingly, India broke into the top 5 countries in terms of GDP. India is now at 3.3 trillion. India surpassed the UK, and pretty much well on track over the next 4 or 5 years to surpass Germany. And pretty much by the turn of the 2020s, as we roll into 2029, 2030, India will certainly surpass Japan. And so, if you think about it, the trajectory from 3.3 trillion, where India is today, to close to a 10 trillion economy and the 3rd largest, certainly makes for a very compelling case. And there's a whole bunch of reforms that's happening. I'll sort of not dwell into this. Maybe that'll come up as part of the conversation. But Anna sort of made a very interesting point earlier about corporate leverage that exists certainly in the US. And I think one of the great tailwinds for India, and if you compare India to any large emerging market, balance sheets of corporate India are significantly delevered, and that is one dynamic that you are not likely to see anywhere else. So India has gone through a very painful period over the last 7 or 8 years, where corporate India and certainly the banking system has taken the pain. There are virtually no zombie companies in India, and balance sheets are pretty pristine. And when you put together all of the other big picture things and the fact that this balance sheet deal leverage has happened, it provides a great setup for the next decade and
just before.
more.
So corporate profits as a percentage of GDP. Do you happen to know what it is for the U.S.?
You're putting me on the spot. You're putting me on the spot. I don't know what's in the U.S.
I do that.
I really cannot know. I don't know, but I think that it is much less than consumer spending.
But maybe we'll come back. You have a question? You have a 10%. We're told by the. Fair enough. Okay, carry on.
Yeah. And so I think in some ways, this sort of, captures most of the stuff that was talked about earlier, right? So I think there's in some ways an alignment of the stars. Geopolitics certainly is an important element for the rise of India. So I think Bill and Stephen spoke about the blocks being created. So India is a very, very important part of the Quad, which is basically Japan, United States, India, and Australia. And I think the world going out over the next 15 years is going to be dramatically different from the world that we've seen over the previous 10 or previous 15. And as supply chains get disaggregated, as you've seen, just in time now, moving to just in case, friend shoring, near shoring, all these are themes that work very, very clearly to India's advantage, and India certainly is putting in place many of the building blocks that will help get us there. And the much heard story about 1.4 billion people and a domestically driven economy, not dependent pretty much beyond a point on what the rest of the world grows at. And I think the most significant aspect is really the demographic dividend that is likely to play out. So the entire world is aging. India is actually becoming younger. More than 2/3 of India's population is below the age of 30. And so just just a few things to sort of get you thinking, right? So, fact is that, 250 years ago, India accounted for 1/4 of the world's GDP. You had the Brits who came in and sort of did what they did. India now accounts for 3% of GDP. India's digital transformation has been stupendous, and there are many exciting opportunities that are available to sort of capture that theme. As the world is moving away from fossil fuels, ESG, and all those conversations, it's important to note that 40% of India's power capacity is actually coming from renewables, so hydro, solar, wind, and what have you. India has a very strong and growing manufacturing base. The world's largest mobile phone manufacturing facility is in India. Samsung. I'm not too sure if too many of us knew that. India has the largest two-wheeler scooter manufacturing facility, and interestingly enough, it's run by 10,000 women. So it's a women-only, plant, and again, pretty stunning and astounding. And India has the world's oldest continuously inhabited city. I don't think, Babylon, Egypt, any other place can boast of that. So just a few things that I wanted to leave you with. I'll hand it back to Mary.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What you mentioned 15. What does the world look like in 15 years and India's place in it?
So I think, if you look at it economically, India certainly is the fastest growing large economy today. So, growth on any given year is likely to be between 6 and 7%. As I said, the growth is linear.
So jump ahead of the growth. What does it look like
in 2030? You're likely to be in the vicinity of 10 trillion. And interestingly enough, many of the folks here were at Davos, and India for the first time laid out a 25-year roadmap, right? And I've never seen policymakers in India thinking 25 years ahead. So there's a 2047 roadmap that's been laid out for India to aspirationally get to 33 trillion, right? 33 trillion. India's per capita GDP today is about $2,200-$2,300. Aspirationally, the country wants to get to $20,000, right? And so you can just imagine 20 years out, if those numbers even get halfway there.
I remember living in Russia and Putin wanted to catch up with Portugal. But that's a major leap.
It's a major leap, and I think, as I said, there's an alignment of the stars in many ways, right? There was a construct that most of us will remember about Brazil, Russia, India, China, right? And 20-25 years out after Lord Jim O'Neill sort of put that paper down, we just need to look back and say, which is the economy or which are the set of countries which have sort of delivered on the promise. Back in 2001, India's GDP was 650 billion. As we sit here today, it's 3.3 trillion. So the trajectory, the growth, all of that has been there, and there's enough and more opportunity. So 2030, 2040, you're looking at India certainly being the third largest in the world. And then all bets are on about what happens to China after that.
I think what's also exciting is it's just like the US, it has the biggest consumers. So that keeps the GDP growing. And it's also a lot more self-sufficient than China and other countries. not as dependent on the outside world. And I think education is making the biggest impact, because I've seen like everyone who's gotten educated has, leapfrogged in terms of where they came from. Yeah. Of course you can.
I want to voice a bit of a contrarian view, actually both on India and China. And it isn't necessarily that I'm convinced what I'm about to say is the scenario is going to happen, but I think it's worth thinking about. It's a probabilistic model. First on India, I'm a bull on India like everyone else in here. I am concerned that there could be a hype about that though, because if you think about it, there are also challenges that India faces. India doesn't have a strong manufacturing base. That's what really helped China propel to the stage that it is. India is a democracy, which is a wonderful thing, but it means that in terms of efficiency is far below China. And the level of education and internet penetration is still fairly slow compared to other countries. So yes, India will go quite far from where it is right now. But the question is, we haven't had a country as large as India, a democratic country, actually be completely propelled to a different trajectory of growth so far, except China has done it. Of course, it's not a democracy there. We have had countries like Japan and South Korea and others who have done it with their model. So if India can accomplish this, I think it would be a huge, huge task. So I am bullish in India, but I want to just say that I think there is room to be a little bit skeptical that there might be too much hype. And China, on the other hand, I think China may well have a second act in its pocket. She may have that as well. Yes, things are not rosy right now, and there are challenges, and the US has picked up its act. We're investing in chips and all those things. But to me, these are short-term, next 3 or 5 year things. I want to look at where the puck is going, but to do that, you have to see where the puck came from. China has invested heavily in infrastructure, far more heavily than anywhere else, and even with our infrastructure act, we won't be anywhere near that. I mean, the thing in China was, I remember I went there when they were building for Olympics, is that you build it and they come. They didn't really wait for people to come and then build it. They would build infrastructure. China has a very monolithic system. It has huge entrepreneurial spirit among their founders and their population, which I think India is just getting into. And of course, it has a huge population.
Well, let me be your devil's advocate. Those entrepreneurs are in prison. They're losing control of their companies. And there's the trust factor has been damaged incredibly. And so I think there are different crosswinds, but maybe I let India have a chance to rebut.
I would just mention 2 things. One is, since India is coming from a lower base, there's a lot of room to grow. And then the second is, India is a very aspirational country. I mean, there are very few places in the world where you see somebody coming, from, very poor circumstances and becoming CEOs of large tech companies in the US. Some of them came from very, very modest beginnings. So those are 2 things I wanted to mention, but I wanted to give you a chance, Zibi, to talk about Poland and to talk about venture capital in Poland. Poland's a very large Eastern European economy, so I'm sure there's a lot to talk about.
Thank you. Okay, Mark asked me to tell you about the 2 projects. So before I will go deeply about the Poland. One of our companies, we have a big conference and exhibition center in Poland, in Rzeszów, which probably was not known at all before the war in Ukraine, but now it's the biggest city close to Ukraine. And because of that, we run a lot of congresses, conferences, and 2 projects I want to mention are, one is for Polish diaspora, and it's called 60 Million Congress. And I have a question: is there anybody here who has a Polish roots. I don't know, grandmas, grandparents came from Poland. Neighbors, okay. So
That counts.
this is not here. You probably know many Polish Americans, and normally when
Cleveland we have a huge population.
yeah. So normally when people think about Poland, we are like 36 million people living in Poland. But in total, we estimate that we are about 60 million people. So that's why we call the project 60 Million Congress. And we do events for Polish diaspora, Polish Americans, Polish British, all around the world. And the next Congress will be in Miami, 9-12 February. So if you're interested to do business with Poland, we'll have about 200 Polish entrepreneurs and ministry from the Ministry of Development and all the other officials. But the second project, which is I think at the moment very, very important and also very important to me myself. As I mentioned, we have this Congress Center close to the Ukrainian border. And what happened? At the beginning of February 2022, 20 days before the war started, the American soldiers knocked our doors and they asked if they can rent the exhibition center. It's 270,000 square foot. And they rented, and we did all the deal within 10 hours. They asked in the morning, and in the midnight, the troops were landing in Rzeszów. And it's of course to make this long story short, after almost 1 year, the war is still not over, and we don't know what's gonna happen, but last year we decided that we want to also support, and as our philanthropy, also working with the big NGOs from United States, like for example, maybe some of you knows, there is Michael Caponi from Global Empowerment Mission from Miami. He landed like 2 days after the war started, and he really do a great job in Ukraine, and talking with all the people, Ukrainians, because as you know, millions of Ukrainians came through the border and through Rzeszów city, and they spread around Poland. So Polish people, we open our houses. So one of the surprises was that when the people from NATO, United Nations came to Poland, they asked where are the camps, the refugee camps, but there was no camps. There were only a few tents at the border where the people could stay like overnight, and then they were picked up by single families and we took them to our homes. So it was, I think, that never happened anywhere in the world before. But still, Ukrainians, they need a lot of help and support. And that's why we created the second project, which we created last year in November. We did a World for Ukraine Summit. And during the first edition, we had more than 1,300 people. And we get the interest from Howard Buffett and Richard Branson and a lot of important people and NGOs, and we had a lot of people which could happen only in Poland at the border because they were allowed to come for 1 or 2 days, like nearly 30 mayors from Ukraine.
Given that perspectives, or those perspectives, how do you see the war playing out?
It's difficult to really have a good forecast what's going to happen, because I believe that the misinformation and propaganda goes on the both sides. But what I see that all the, let's say, NATO soldiers, there is more and more soldiers there. When I go to Rzeszów, I see every time more weapons, more soldiers. They search for a land. They rent hotels from my friends for few years contract. So from this single information I collect on site, I do not expect that this war is gonna end within next months or maybe even not a year.
I think too many people are making too much money for the war to end anytime soon. I just wanted to touch very quickly on what excites you guys in your field, in venture capital, or private equity or public markets. So can we touch on that really quickly, because Mark, how much time do we have left?
Just we can definitely do that.
Thanks.
Sure. There's actually a lot that excites us, at least in our world. And can you guys hear me? Well, okay.
Keep the mic close. The back can't hear you very well.
Okay. There's a lot that excites us in Silicon Valley, and certainly in our line of work in early stage venture capital, which is really different from the later stage, because we have much better valuations that we can invest in. I would probably put 3 to 4 areas that are our focus. Certainly one of them is AI, and not just ChatGPT and large language models, but the gradual evolution of AI into a system that can actually solve problems, not just enhance the solutions. So we think that that is going to continue to go further. I am a little bit concerned with all the hype around ChatGPT because it is something that amazes us, and somehow we are programmed to think that anything that amazes us must be terribly useful. That's not necessarily the case.
Maybe the battery. Take mine. It was time to go to. No.
Okay, you're not going to get this one back again. So anyway, AI is certainly an area of focus for us, and that's what really excites me. Second area, I would broadly say infrastructure, and not just because we have a huge infrastructure bill, but because the world has realized after COVID that we do need to have infrastructure. We do need, as somebody said, just in case, we do need resilience in our systems, and it is not just the US, and I think this has been a good development, as well as supply chain areas. I mean, once we get that in, how do we get it effectively and cost effectively to the customers and to the businesses? Healthcare continues to be a very promising area. I think that over the next 20 to 50 years, we would probably see the most dramatic changes in healthcare industry compared to any other area. And finally, what I would broadly call inclusion platforms. We still need to get more people online. We still need to get more people into the financial infrastructure. We're all talking about tokens and crypto and all that, and yet we have many millions of people, even in the US, who are not banked or underbanked. So all of those things, along with getting them into the healthcare system to keep them healthy, would be very important for the society. So those are some of the things that excites me.
Thanks. Whatever we sort of discussed previously on India was more top-down. For us as investors, really the opportunity in India is as much bottom-up, right? And through that process, there's 3 broad areas that we are incredibly excited about. So first and foremost, as Mary was alluding to as well, was just the entire consumption opportunity in India. The sheer power of 1.4 billion people aspiring and consuming is something that simply cannot be ignored, and that has manifestations in a whole bunch of sectors and segments and opportunities. So that's one big pocket. The second big pocket is really the financialization opportunity. So as Safa was saying, in India, you've had this generational shift where traditional household savings are now starting to move to financial products. So, and that has ramifications for banking, non-banks, financial services, life insurance, non-life, payments businesses, and a whole bunch of other things. So that's the third big pocket. And I think perhaps as we look out at the future, the entire digital transformation that's underway is generational, and that digital transformation is clear and present and playing out in ways that's leading to exponential outcomes. And again, so that's the third big opportunity. We've seen this playing out certainly in the US 15 and 20 years ago. We've seen that playing out in China 7 or 8 years ago. And as we look out over the next 10 years, the whole digital opportunity is very significant and profound. One final parting thought on that, to the point that you were making, right? I think, as you think about emerging markets, and India certainly, it's important to be mindful of the risks, right? And as we think about the economy and the country, for us as investors, while we have a very clear line of sight on what is it that we will invest in or where the opportunity sets are, there's a whole bunch of no-go areas for us as investors because they're fraught with different kinds of risks, right? And I'll just highlight two. So infrastructure and real estate. If you were sitting here and looking into India, almost all of us would say that the infrastructure opportunity in India is significant and powerful. But does that necessarily mean that it translates into significant investable opportunities, which will end up making significant, growth and returns over time? And I think that equation sometimes doesn't balance out, which is why many investors have had a bad experience. So it's important, we think, to know what not to do, and we are very, very clear and conscious about that. Mary.
I just have one quick question for you. What really frustrates me about India is the devaluation of the Indian rupee. So as somebody from the US with US dollars, it makes it so difficult to invest there. So at what point does the devaluation end?
Arguably, it makes it more interesting for the moment.
Yeah. No, I think so last year was actually an aberration, right? Because the dollar did what it did. It sort of taken out the yen, the pound, and everything else in between, right? And so the Indian currency was not sort of insulated from that. But I think if you look, Mary, over the last 10 or 15 years, on an average, I think you see the currency depreciating between 3.5% right? And I think the trick to investing in India is to be able to identify those businesses which can take these macro headwinds in their stride, come through these large dislocations, and then compound returns over an extended period of time. And I would certainly make the argument that there are many, many, many businesses like that which are able to look past the broader macro challenges that may exist and deliver really, really high growth over time, right? And just keeping in mind that all of the governance and transparency and disclosure frameworks pretty much being in place, because I guess most emerging market investors have that concern. So I would also make the case and argument that governance and transparency standards in India are significantly better now than they were, and in many cases arguably in line with certainly the US and Europe for sure.
Thank you. So, Zibi, what are some of the more interesting opportunities to invest in Poland right now?
I think in Poland it's quite interesting situation because I think we never had such a big awareness and so many news about Poland, and that's of course despite the situation with Ukraine, but that's also for the business. This is a huge opportunity, and for Poland as well. So I expect that the number of investments will grow rapidly, and I see that so many venture capitals are coming now to Poland, and real estate investors we had a pandemic, and for example the market completely changed. Before the pandemic you were talking about the Naples, but with so big number with refugees and the people coming from Ukraine, and also all the parties they are coming because of the war. What happened before the pandemic, the real estate market was that the 80% of the properties were bought by the people, and they took a loan to buy their condo or house. Last year, 80% of real estate was bought by cash. But
that's more than Naples.
But another 80% of this 80% was bought by the international investors. So at the moment, the market in Poland is changing because 70-80% of the families, we owned our own flat or our own house. Now we are going into the direction of a rental. So it's a big change. And what excites me, because that was part of the questions, is Me personally, I run my companies in Poland and for a few years in United States, and I see that the Polish companies, after the changes 1989, we had a big market enough to grow in Poland and a little bit in Europe. But now the companies are ready to grow up globally, more and more companies. And this situation at the moment, what happened with the Ukraine, I was in United States last year having this congress in Miami in February. I came back and the war started, and I heard in Warsaw a lot of my friends, we were meeting and they said geopolitical diversification, which was like a new word during the investors. They just saw and understood that I have 100% of my assets in Poland and we want to change it. So there is a lot of opportunities because a lot of companies, a lot of owners, they want to get some investors because they want to diverse and they want to invest in US, and they will set up the offices in US and other countries. And that's I see as a huge opportunity to work to invest in Poland or to look for the companies from Poland to invest in them to make them global.
Can I have a quick question for Safa based on being from Iran and stuff? I watch the news a lot, try to read the papers. It looks very hopeful. What's the reality? Is it practical? Any opportunity for change in government or more freedom in that country?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Unfortunately, I can't be optimistic in the near term. The hold that this government has on the society and the infrastructure they have built is, and I don't mean to be hyperbolic here, but it's really akin to what Nazi Germany built in terms of their military infrastructure, the SS and the Gestapo and all that. We have the IRGC, and then we have separate other forces, and the actual military is really minimized in their role. So with that much, and then in addition to their military power, they have built huge economic power. So there is a group of probably 1% or so, maybe 500,000, 1 million people who are hugely benefiting from all of these things. And they are also supporting the government. The majority, of course, is suffering. The economy is terrible. I think it will take a few years, but the good thing is that I think we have started to see the beginning of the end. So there is no going back. The level of outrage that people publicly voice has never been there before. So I don't think we're going back to where we were, but I would think it would take several years before we have some resolution.
My information may be outdated, let me know if it is, but my understanding with regard to the 4 major obstacles for India's realizing its potential. One is very strong state rule and their ability to have such things as tariffs, I believe, or some sort of or obstacles to interstate trucking. Or tariffs for interstate trucking, things of this nature. 2, eminent domain. 3, a very, very, very slow legal process so that contract enforcement exists only in theory. Also perhaps even very strong biases according to in which state one of the litigants may be from. And then finally, whether Dalits have either the aspiration themselves or obstacles in their way, or the education that would be needed.
We were trying to have a last quick comment, and then you throw this out.
Boy.
Come join our 361 firm community of investors and thought leaders. We have a lot of events created by the community as we collaborate on investments and philanthropic interests. Join us.